Canberra Chess Club Club Championship 2023, Round 9, the final judgment. Behold, a king shall reign in righteousness, and princes shall rule in judgment. Tonight I played the last game in a tournament I spent so long preparing for. With all the energy I had invested in preparing for this tournament, and also considering that this might be the last over-the-board competitive chess game I play in a long time, my main goal was to soak up the experience and play a solid game of chess. I got paired with a skillful player who was a half point ahead of me in the standings, and this did make me slightly nervous. But in my preparation for this tournament, I practiced playing against skillful players so that I would be comfortable under the pressure of doing so. In fact, I played a practice game against Australia's highest rated Grandmaster, and knowing that I played well against him allowed me to have faith that I could also play well against this opponent here tonight. I settled in mentally for what could be a long, hard battle. We shook hands, started the clock, and he, with the white pieces, opened with knight f3, a flexible move, often transposing to queen's pawn openings. I responded in kind with knight f6, and after d4, moving the queen's pawn, I prioritised kingside development and opened a path for my dark-squared bishop by playing e6. And then on bishop f4, I played d5, staking my claim in the centre. All very normal moves thus far. He continued with e3, and I decided, rather than going for c5, which is a normal and often important move to play from the black side of queen's pawn openings, I once again decided to prioritise kingside development and simply opted to oppose his bishop with bishop d6, preparing to castle. In the sense that chess is a debate between two minds, my argument here was, you can't hurt me. I'm going to get my king to safety. I'm open to trading pieces because that simplifies the position and, in a sense, reduces your ability to win. If you'd like to win, you'll have to really stretch yourself to go over and above the simple but indisputable and solid defenses I'm putting up. Responding to my argument, rather than taking my bishop, simplifying the position, reducing his ability to attack me, and helping me develop my queen, and instead of allowing me to take his bishop and damage his central pawn structure, he made the rebuttal that by retreating his bishop to g3, I would in fact be hurting myself if I insisted on taking his bishop. Yes, pieces would vanish from the board, but he would recapture with the h-pawn and open up his rook towards the side of the board I'm planning to castle on, hence setting up the preconditions for a possible mating attack. He had a point. I had to concede. Taking the bishop at this point would not be good for me, and so I did not take his bishop. But since he spent a tempo moving his bishop for a second time, I took the liberty of using a second tempo on my already developed knight. My argument being that by centralizing my knight, I threatened to capture his bishop with the knight, and although he gets the open h file, as he had previously argued, I would in turn bag for myself the bishop pair, which would confer an advantage to me. My other point of argument was that although we would both have some advantage after knight takes bishop, his being the open h file and mine being the bishop pair, I would come out better off because his advantage could only ever be prosecuted if he could rush his pieces toward my king. But by trading his bishop off the board, I was not only bagging the bishop pair, but also reducing his firepower and diminishing any attacking potential, thereby in turn diminishing the importance of his open h-file. Additionally, I may not take the bishop. I may yet play f5 instead and solidify my knight. Who is to say? In summary, Your Honour, knight e4 constitutes a flexible and fundamentally solid move. On knight b to d2, the court had in essence accepted my submission. If I wanted to, I could proceed with knight takes bishop, prosecuting that line of argument. And so I did. I took his bishop and gave him the h-file for his rook, but in return reduced the amount of firepower he had at hand to use against me, and obtained for myself the bishop pair. It was again my move, and I followed up with b6, opting again to delay c5. Although that would also still be a fine move, it would lead to a more open position, whereas I wanted to constrain the arguments we were having as much as possible to parameters I could understand. By delaying c5 and keeping the position slightly more closed for now, and by instead playing b6, I was preparing once again in a flexible way to follow up with either bishop b7 or possibly bishop a6, and possibly to build up to c5 with additional support from that b6 pawn. Again, Your Honour, playing flexibly and solidly, you cannot argue with that, surely. "Objection," came the cry from the opposing side. "Your Honour, b6 is too slow. I, as the white team, am attacking black on the king side. Meanwhile, black is playing slow pawn moves on the queen side. Here I can play bishop d3 and take aim at the h7 pawn. And once black responds to that threat, I'll continue with knight h4, queen f3, castles long, and ultimately, my attack will outpace his defences. b6 is not a move that should be permitted, Your Honour." This was the first blow of the game, and I was taken slightly aback. I had to question my beliefs about the position. It's true, with bishop d3, the h7 pawn was under fire. He was attacking it now with his bishop and his rook, the rook enjoying its influence on the h-file and apparently justifying his earlier argument that I should not have taken his bishop. But I was sure my arguments had been sound up until this point, and besides, I had to find a way now to play on. I thought about g6, blocking his bishop's diagonal, but creating holes in my kingside that he could work to exploit later in the game. h6 maybe could be played. Again, I thought about f5, creating a weakened backward pawn on e6. But then I saw a better move, the best move, as the judge would later decree. And I'd like to ask you watching to consider what you would do in this position, if not g6, h6, or f5. Well, I'll give you one more moment. Your Honour, the objection should not be sustained because although I played a slow pawn move on the queen side and allowed him to put increasing pressure on my king side, I adhere to my original argument that he does not have sufficient firepower to prosecute a deadly kingside attack. The whole idea that the h7 pawn is in need of defense is farcical and plainly wrong as a matter of fact. See, if I play here knight d7 and the bishop takes the pawn, then knight f8 hits the bishop for a second time, and note that that bishop is actually pinned and cannot move lest it leave the h-file rook on pre. And if instead the rook takes the pawn, then rook takes rook, bishop takes rook, and g6 prevents the bishop from escaping, and I will eventually win that bishop. "Objection!" Again, my opponent chimed in, claiming that here he would sacrifice the bishop for 2 pawns by taking on g6, hence also ruining my kingside pawn structure. However, Your Honour, I continued my argument, in this scenario I maintain that despite the fact that my kingside pawns would be ruined, the fundamental fact remains that white would lack the firepower to ultimately take advantage of my damaged king side. For instance, if knight h4, bringing the knight closer and allowing the queen to enter, then queen f6 keeps everything protected, leaving white simply down too much material to have any realistic hope of winning in the endgame. The judge looked carefully upon this issue, and then dismissed my opponent's original objection, he ruled in my favour, allowing my move b6, and after bishop d3, the continuation of knight d7, agreeing with me that the pawn on h7 was, for deeper purposes, immune from capture. But my opponent had different ideas. He disagreed with both of us, and appealed to a higher court. After a long consideration period, he stubbornly persisted and pushed on with rook takes h7. I looked back briefly at the judge of this new court, whose knowing gaze returned to me a sense of confidence that I was right, and he knew it. I played on, rook takes rook, and after bishop takes rook I played as planned g6, preventing the bishop from escaping. Committed now, not so much to the truth, but to the path he'd chosen for himself, my opponent continued on with knight h4, insisting that he could put so much pressure on the g6 pawn, and my king's side in general, that he could ultimately win. But I played knight f8, defending the g6 pawn, and hitting the bishop, forcing it to g8, all without interfering with my queen's line of sight. One thing I'd missed in my calculations was that, due to the placement of my knight, my king was unable to move nearer to the bishop, and hence the bishop, despite having no escape route, was now safe, at least for the time being. I thought about a bunch of other moves, but ultimately realized that in order to manifest the truth of my original argument, that after preventing his bishop from escaping, I would capture it somehow, I would have to play queen f6 now, which I did, threatening queen g7, at which point his bishop would die. He responded with queen f3, offering and hoping for a queen trade, but I played as planned with queen g7, and his bishop was not long for this life. He gave it up for the second pawn with check, and I recaptured. We then traded queens, which, as it happened, brought my king in just in time to the defense of my g6 pawn, and then he castled long. My contention back when I played knight d7 was that if he took the h7 pawn, I would be able to weather his attack and then emerge with the extra material and be in a winning endgame. I also contended that by having the bishop pair, as well as that extra material, I would in fact be quite a lot better in the endgame. The judge had come down in my favour on these matters as well, but I still had work to do. At any point in the process of converting my advantage into a victory, I could easily make the wrong move and become overextended. For instance, I thought about g4, hitting the knight and forcing it back to f3, followed by king f6, defending the pawn, and encroaching on his position. But here I didn't like that he might play e4, because if I take, he takes back with check and a double attack on the g5 pawn. And if I don't take, he's threatening to play e5 with a fork on my king and bishop. Another way I might become overextended is if I played e5, opening more scope for my light squared bishop. Here he could play pawn takes pawn, and then after bishop takes pawn, knight d to f6, hitting the bishop with his knight, and hitting the pawn with his rook. I saw I could defend both by bringing my king further up, but again this seemed to run the risk of becoming overextended and entering into an excessively risky position, one that could backfire terribly. Your Honour, based on the above analysis, the issue with e5 is that it leaves the d5 pawn undefended. Therefore I now submit the move bishop d7, developing my bishop, allowing my rook more scope along the back rank, and importantly protecting the d5 pawn so that in future I can play e5 without allowing any counterplay to my opponent. The judge again allowed my submission, and it was time to hear again from my opponent. He responded with rook h1, again trying to make use of the h file he'd opened earlier on, persisting with that argument. and not getting anywhere with it, but still forcing me to carry on in the battle and to be careful not to make a misstep. I considered moving my knight to get it further up the board, but then I realized that my knight on f8, despite being on the back rank, was a completely golden piece. It protected the g6 pawn, and it prevented any future possibility of his rook infiltrating via h7. I remembered the old chess saying, with a knight on f8, there is no mate. I realized this construction was quite safe, despite appearances. I considered calmly moving my king over to the other side of the board, again just arguing that I have more material, and as long as my king is safe, my opponent can never win. But then again, as I have stated, with my knight on f8, my king already was safe. And furthermore, I wanted my king to stay on the king side, so I would not allow him to get his pawn majority moving. If it did, it may steamroll me and allow him to promote pawns to new queens. I thought about rook e8 to prepare e5, but then I realized e5 doesn't need any further preparation now that I've played bishop b7. In fact, if I play rook e8, he can play f4, and that prevents e5. Therefore, all things considered, I played e5 immediately. Here I argued that if he takes and I take back, my bishops have increased their scope and hence become more powerful, which is good for me. And if he tries not to take, for example, knight h to f3, then e4 would be a strong follow-up. He took the pawn, I recaptured, and he played knight h to f3, attacking the bishop. I could have dropped to f6 to prevent his knight using g5, but I opted to drop the bishop all the way back to g7, where it prevents his rook from accessing h8 or h6. Now his rook has no infiltration squares at all in my territory, and even if he plays knight g5 check, I can play king f6, attacking his knight, and it has nowhere to go. Again, a very strange looking position, but concretely there's nothing wrong here for me at all. He really couldn't make a counter-argument at this stage. Everything was good for me. And so his focus seemed to shift. He decided to go into damage control and try to stave off any of my attacking potential. He played c3, blunting the dark squared bishop's diagonal and asking me again to prove myself right without going wrong. I just sat back again, looked at the position, and let my thoughts evolve. His knight might be wanting to land on d4, and I could prevent that with c5, but then again, as much as I do want the position to be open so as to benefit my bishops, I also still want to control the parameters of this argument we're having, and I can do that with greater control by keeping that part of the board more closed, at least for now. I could instead play knight e6, so that I can always capture his knight with my knight, if it lands on d4. And I also prevent knight g5 check entirely, reducing his options. Also, my rook could swing across and threaten to trade for his rook, simplifying the position. It's once again one of those flexible and solid moves, so yes, that's what I played. Here, my opponent thought long and hard about his options. This gave me time to keep thinking about my options on his time. I realized that due to the fact that his rook had no good way to make use of the h-file, it might actually be misplaced there on h1. It might be better off placed in the middle of the board somewhere. It's funny how his whole argument had started about the usefulness of the h-file, but now the h-file is just plainly useless. But anyway, if I've come to this realization, then maybe he has as well, and as a consequence he might want to move it away from the h-file and on to greener pastures. And so if I do swing my rook over to h8 and offer a trade, he might either accept the trade and get rid of his useless rook, or decline the trade by moving off the h-file, in which case my offer to trade rooks might just push him in the direction he ought to go, towards the center. And although that would leave me in possession of the h-file, I also would not be able to make use of it. His knight on f3 always guards the infiltration square on h2, his rook on the first rank always prevents me from getting to h1, and all of this reasoning helped me to see that I'd be better off opening my rook's capacity along the a-file with a move like a5, rather than playing the rook across the h-file. This way, I would also further restrict him by taking away possibilities like b4. Finally, it's one of those slow, encroaching moves that puts more pressure on him, much like the moves I was a victim of in round 8. He interrupted my thought process by playing his move, rook h7. I guess that was one downside of my knight e6 move, the f8 knight no longer being there to defend the infiltration of his pieces. I could return the knight to f8, taking advantage of the flexibility and reversibility of the knight move I had made, and that would force his rook back out. But then, if I want to return my knight back to e6, I'm allowing him to return his rook to h7, essentially offering a draw by repetition. And I don't want that, not at this point. Your Honour, I announced, if it pleases the court, it's true his rook doth seem frightful, having infiltrated all the way to h7, whenceforth it pinneth my bishop. But may it not be also said that there's no way for white to gang up further on the pinned piece, and hence his rook is powerless? Is he not vulnerable to my continuing with a5, increasing the power of my rook towards his king? I submit this, rather than playing rook h8, offering the trade of rooks, which only lessens my own offensive power for no tangible reason. The judge accepted this, and it was now up to my opponent to prove me wrong, if in fact I am wrong. And was I wrong? Only after I played the move I realized that because my bishop's pinned, he can in fact play knight e5 check, and my bishop is unable to capture the knight. But as I'd mentioned to the judge, this doesn't hit my bishop for a second time, and therefore poses no real threat to my bishop, so I can simply move my king away and everything should still be fine. In fact, on further consideration, I noticed that if he does play the move knight e5 check, it would be a big blunder. No sooner than I realized this, he made it evident that he had not. His hand moved out towards the knight. Was he going to make a big mistake? He stopped, withdrew his hand, and ran it through his hair with an uncertain look upon his face. Biting the corner of his lip and grimacing, he completed a handy circumnavigation of his scalp before resolving to return his hand out confidently towards his knight, as if his confidence would dispel any fundamental problems with the move, and hence he confidently played the worst move in the position, knight e5 check. One last time I glanced up at the judge, who, with a wry smile and a subtle nod, gave me the blessing to resume. And then I played the final move, both of this game and of my tournament. Before I show you though, can you see where he went wrong? What would you do to make the most of this scenario if you were in my shoes? I'll give you a moment here. Ready? The final move of my 2023 Club Championship was a movement of the king. Behold, a king shall reign in righteousness, and princes shall rule in judgment. The king leading his forces to one final victory, and doing so with a retreating move, demonstrating wisdom and restraint, involving himself in the battle, ensuring the safety of his underlings, and simultaneously enabling them to flourish, much like a great father. And let me say at this point that I love you, Dad, so much, and happy birthday. This one's for you. I grabbed my king and started moving toward g8. But even before my king landed on g8, my opponent stopped the clock and resigned on the spot. The judgment? Well, on king g8, his rook is hit, and also the bishop is unpinned, which means his knight is also hit. There's no way for him to defend both pieces. And remember, he's already down material from his earlier sacrifice of the bishop for 2 pawns. In summary, my arguments won out, despite a hard-fought fight. As always, I thanked my opponent for the game and we had a brief discussion about key moments. As it turned out, the computer agrees that he was wrong to sacrifice his bishop for 2 pawns, and the way I played was a very accurate refutation of his mistake. I only played objectively good moves, and I'm very glad that I finished the tournament on that strongly positive note. In the final standings, I came out with 5.5 points out of a possible 9. Obviously not as good as I was hoping or believed myself to be capable of, but nonetheless placing me in position tied for 4th place. Not too shabby. I hope you've enjoyed this video as well as this whole series, and I hope you'll come back soon to hear what will come next for this YouTube channel. Hit subscribe and the notification button so you don't miss out. Like, share and comment as well. And until next time, take care of yourselves and others. Bye for now.